Okay, let people into the event now. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator, and tonight we are very proud to be hosting our first event of 2021, the launch of That Old Country Music by Kevin Barry. I'm sharing a link to buy the book in the chat, and all copies from us will have signed bookplates. Kevin will be in conversation with Karan Mahajan. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and they can take your questions at the end of the event. And I'll introduce our speakers now. Karan Mahajan is the author of Family Planning, a finalist for the International Dylan Thomas Prize, and the Association of Small Bombs, which is shortlisted for the 2016 National Book Award, and which won the 2017 Young Lions Fiction Award. His reporting and criticism have appeared in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, the New Republic, and the New Yorker Online, as well as other venues, and he teaches at Brown University. Kevin Barry is the author of the novels Night Boat to Tangier, Beetlebone, and City of Bohane, and the story collections Dark Lies the Island and There Are Little Kingdoms. His awards include the Dublin Literary Award, the Goldsmith Prize, and the Sunday Times Short Story Prize. His stories and essays appear in The New Yorker, Granta, and elsewhere. He also works as a playwright and screenwriter and lives in County Sligo, Ireland. I'll hand it over now.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be almost in real life at the Powerhouse Arena. Thanks, Karen, so much for doing this with me as well. Just at the top of our show this evening, of this very special transmission from a swamp in County Sligo. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the first story, actually, in the collection, That Old Country Music. This is a story called The Coast of Leitrim. A man in his 30s who lives on a hill about 15 miles in that direction over there, finds himself dangerously obsessed with a young Polish lady who works in his local coffee shop. He's in the coffee shop and he's about to ask her out on a date. So it's a nervous moment that we joined the story at. He was about to stand and make grimly for the counter. He felt like a man heading off to be shot, when she stepped out from behind it and for absolutely no good reason came to saunter around his table, looking out at the rain that as sure as Jesus had returned to make another wet joke of the summer. Back to the usual, she said. You'd nearly do away with yourself altogether, Seamus Ferris said. What do you mean, she said. Nothing by it, he said. Do you want to go out with me sometime? That would be fine, she said. When is this happening? He believed now that they were in telepathic contact with each other. She must have known and read his intention. She must have known too that he had sensed her likely compliance. This was how fatedness worked, how love discovered itself. In the long 3 days, the endless 3 nights that led up to their Sunday meeting, he attempted to send mental messages down Dromard Hill and across the slow meander of the river. The content of these messages was, even to himself, uncertain, but had to do with ardency and truth. The Sunday of their arrangement came up to dense clouds and a heavy mugginess. He went to the toilet 5 times in the morning and took Imodium against the thunder of his insides. Attraction as physical catastrophe was not exactly news to Seamus Ferris. He had been besotted before. Always it was with slightly humorless-looking women who appeared to be in a condition of vague disbelief about the world. Involved in any level of romance, he was given to lurchy moves and hot declarations, and always in the past he had scared the women off within a few dates. He had not had anything even close to sex for 3 years. With Catherine, he vowed all would be different. He met her by the bridge at 3. The arrangement was for a spin in the van. Have you ever been to the coast of Leitrim? He asked her, unpromisingly. No, she said. It has a coast. The coast of Leitrim, he said, is 4 kilometres long, which is in fact the shortest length of coast belonging to any county in Ireland. Now I know, she said. I mean, barring the landlocked counties, he said. Okay, she said. As he drove, And they went through the rituals of small talk. He tried to communicate with her directly too, without words, by way of pure mental focus. He tried to let her know that he needed her badly and that in his own modest way he was a prospect. He told her that he had a house that wanted work but was situated well. There were few bills. There was more than an acre of land to grow vegetables and flowers, and already he had begun this garden. It could be beautiful yet, he said. As they drove out the Cortober side of town, a parade of drunken women skittered towards the bridge in glittery cowboy hats and stretched nylon skirts with bottles of skinny Prosecco to hand, and in their eyes the dissolute, the haunted look of a 3-day hen at its fag end, and emblazoned on their tight-fitting t-shirts the legend, Mohill Pussy Posse. And with something already close to love, he turned to see the tip of Catherine's nose rise to match his own disdain. Why would they do this to themselves? Catherine said. There's a sickness around the place, Seamus said. A rare thing occurred then in the van as it hoovered up the N4, a companionable silence. To his awe, he found that they were perfectly comfortable with each other, and they didn't even have to try. So it started at a awkward moment, and the story has now entered a more hopeful time, I think. We'll have to see how it works out.
Thank you, Kevin. I hope we'll hear more from you as the evening progresses. I'd love to hear you read from a couple more stories.
Sure.
Even briefly. But first, I just wanted to say it's a real honor to be meeting virtually with Kevin. I'm sitting in Providence. He's in Ireland. And, you know, by way of introduction, I was just thinking, Kevin is such a vital, feverish, dissonant, rude, and menacingly hilarious writer of prose that I'm going to actually use his own words to describe him and hang him. And this comes from the story St. Catherine of the Fields, where the narrator is describing an old Irish song. And I think this is actually a very good description of Kevin's work. It goes, "It should have been a famously dark standard. It presented a very involved narrative and a most troubling story. All of human cruelty was contained within it, but something too, I thought, of what love means. Its tone was truly a one-off. The verses were charged with a kind of erotic mania. There's definitely erotic mania in the work that resonated all too sharply with my own contemporary funk. Its characters were deformed by desire, and thus the song blew familiar notes through the slutty arcades of my middle-aged brain. It was about lust, betrayal, sexual jealousy. It was meat and drink to me." You know, and reading this collection, I think one is struck obviously not just by the sheer power of Kevin's prose, which in its kind of like impressionistic qualities really reminds me of a writer that I know Kevin and I are both fond of, who is Saul Bellow. But also just the way you sort of enchant the landscape of Ireland, so that it kind of enfolds everyone and you can kind of feel its sort of clammy wetness on your skin as you're reading the collection. And also, I think most importantly, Kevin is an extremely funny writer. You know, just one line that stands out is a character thinking about how hideous he is, and he says he hadn't enjoyed a mirror since the late 80s, right? So there's a lot of like wonderful one-liners, but there's also just a great number of wise moments that are juxtaposed with the one-liners. Like in the story that I quoted, there's another line which says, "Love, we are reminded yet again, is not about staring into each other's eyes. Love is about staring out together in the same direction, even if the gaze has menace or badness underlain." So Kevin, I thought that maybe as an opening question, I'd love to hear from you how organically this theme of different configurations of desire emerged in the collection, because at least 6 of the 11 stories are directly concerned with desire. So yeah, I'm curious how that came about.
Well, you quoted the phrase "slutty arcades" of the middle-aged mind, and I think you definitely caught me on that one. Yeah, it's interesting as a story writer. It's 8 years or 9 years almost, unbelievably, since my last collection came out, and you kind of, when I was putting this collection together, I kind of gathered what lying around the house, and there were maybe about 20 stories from that period in a kind of a finished or nearly finished condition. And of course, you look for the ones then that kind of speak to each other and that kind of resonate. And the themes do come up. The themes do resonate, and this kind of erotic mania and this kind of general sense of brokenheartedness, I think, as well, that goes through so many of the stories. They are love stories often. Never, not always hugely happy in their outcomes, but it was what was interesting, because it's quite a decent stretch of time since the last collection, is I could definitely see myself changing as a writer, in terms of how I would approach certain stories. St. Catherine of the Fields actually is the most recent story, which I finished just about a year ago, actually, when I was away. So that gap is very interesting to look at. The very cool thing about a collection of stories is you never have to sit down and write the book. You know, if you're in the habit of trying to get short stories, they accumulate over time, and it becomes a nice record of what you are at during this period as a story writer, but also, I guess, as how you were changing as a person. I definitely feel like I'm probably less excitable on the page as a writer than I was 8 or 9 years ago. That there's, in places, I hope there's a quality of calmness coming into the prose that wasn't there in my earlier works, where the prose was literally jumping up and down on the page like an hysterical kind of jazz dancing child looking for attention. And I hope it's kind of that it's quietened in some way and allowed me to kind of slow down through the gears and really kind of go into the sort of themes that kind of emerge again and again, this kind of brokenheartedness, this kind of very often thwarted desire.
No, I mean, I do think I was struck by the range. You know, the prose is always full and rich, but there are stories like the story of, which is titled Roma Girl, which is a very quiet but super surprising story about a young girl who kind of runs away from her homeless family and finds shelter somewhere else, right? But what I was also struck by was that, unlike your novels, these particular stories aren't playing as much with genre. There's a couple that do, right? But like you have in your novels, you defiantly and definitely take on a kind of genre, the Western, or two tough guys talking at a court or something, and you spin it around. So why was this tonally quite different from those?
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, you mentioned Saul Bellow, who was also always a great touchstone for me. And what I love in Bellow's work is the blend of high and low, really, where it's a language that's really kind of that's torqued, you know, to an incredibly high standard. But he's quite prepared to go into moments of very kind of low comedy. And Bellow is really interesting in books like Humboldt's Gift, when he kind of ventures into gangster world. So I've really enjoyed doing that in the novels. There are a couple of stories in here that are kind of genre pieces, I think. The story Ox Mountain Death Song is one of my kind of neo-westerns, I guess. But yeah, I when I'm writing a short story, I guess I'm quite old-fashioned as a story writer. I'm telling a tale. I'm interested in that. What's very interesting about this book for me as well, the stories, is that the way they follow you around in the world. They're really good. I remember years ago reading the introduction John Cheever wrote to his collected stories, a great kind of doorstopper that came out in the late 70s, I think. And he said one of the great things about being a short story writer is it gives you a very vivid sense of where you were physically and emotionally in your life at different times when you look back in those stories. And it's really interesting now that they followed me into the kind of rural northwest of Ireland, which isn't where I'm from. I grew up in cities and in suburbs, so it's definitely, I see in my work a tendency to mythologize my immediate surroundings, but it turns out to be such a crucial decision in any writer or artist's life, actually, where you live, where you're going to base yourself, you know. It often seems like a pragmatic thing, like where's the housing cheap enough so that I don't have to do 40 jobs. But it becomes a central creative decision in your life also, because, you know, the environs, the environment starts to come out on the page, and probably brings you to places that are a surprise to you.
Well, I want to come actually to the issue of place you just raised in a second, but before that, I'm interested in what you said about the stories being a kind of record, right? You have this 9-year period where you're producing stuff and you put it all in a book. But I know that when you've talked about writing novels, you've mentioned how important cohesion and sort of completing a novel in a compressed time frame, let's say a year, is, because it means that you haven't changed that much as a person.
Yeah.
Right. That the person ending the novel is not a completely different character than the one who began it. So how do you balance that with these stories over 9 years? I mean, was there not a part of you that looked at, I can't tell which ones were written early or late, but like, was there a part of you that looked at some of them and was like, this is a different person, I'm kind of horrified, or like, I have to really revise it to make it fit with the aesthetic that I believe in now? Or are these just...
It's weird. You give yourself little rules, I guess. And I kind of made a rule when I was looking back over the stories that I wasn't going to kind of fix anything. You know, I wasn't going to, because I think that would make the story look right to your mind in that particular day or week, but months down the road or years down the road, it wouldn't. So I was careful not to. There was a couple of terrible lines in earlier stories that I did cut, but generally I stuck to the rule of kind of just leaving them as they were, and allow myself to hang myself on the page. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like a very different writer when I'm writing a novel compared to a short story. I think because I didn't publish early. I did my first book of stories with a small press came out when I was 37. So which is, you know, late enough in the day for a first book. And I had lots of experience of trying to write novels in like my 20s and early 30s, where the classic kind of rookie error of kind of spending too long on a book and not letting it get away. And you know, you start a book when you're 26 and finish a draft of it when you're 30, and it's very hard to make it cohere and come together because you're changing on a daily and a weekly basis. So my tendency with the novels is to do very, very quick first drafts, to write them inside 3 or 4 months, maybe go 7 days a week, just to keep that kind of thread going at the subconscious level where so much of your fiction happens. And you know, I early on in the first draft, and it's the same with stories, I don't worry so much about the sentences. I'm just trying to get a kind of a mound of material that I can try and shape and kind of put manners on in subsequent drafts. But it changes, you know. The great thing about short stories is obviously enough when one of them works out, and it's rare enough, but very often towards the end of, when it's a good one, towards the end of a first draft, it's almost like you can hear a little click where you go, okay, there's something here that's maybe an approach that I haven't used before, or the character has really come alive on the page. I don't know, do you write stories as well, Karen, as well as novels, or is it?
Actually, very infrequently, and I want to change. I mean, I'm really amazed that you can do so many different genres as well, because I struggle. I find stories harder because you need to have it needs to have a knockout.
Yeah.
As a novel, you can kind of, you know, bumble along and still finish it off.
Yeah, with like the stories, you just have no space for mistakes, I find. You can get away with murder in a novel. It can go off on all sorts of tangents, because it's the glorious thing about a novel is that it's gloriously loose. And if the sentences are good enough and the paragraphs are good enough, the reader will forgive you almost anything in a novel and will go in different directions with you. Whereas I think they're much more unforgiving in the story. And you have to attach the reader to this little world inside half a page, really. You know, it's so little space to play with. I remember years ago, but before I was a published fiction writer, I used to do lots of journalism and kind of literary journalism and stuff. And I remember interviewing the great Scottish story writer James Kelman. But it must have been about 2000. He had a book out called Translated Accounts, I think it was, a collection of stories that came out around then. I remember talking to him about stories, and he said a really kind of resonant thing to me that has turned out to be true. He said it's not easier that they get, you know, the more you do them in some strange way, the more kind of practiced you become with stories, the less you know about them. The closer in you get to the kind of workings, it's mysterious how they work out. I do have a weird thing where I try and it worked out actually. The first story that I read a little bit from Coast of Leitrim, I started work on that, I remember, on a Monday, having finished the novel Nightboat to Tangier on the Saturday. And it's weird. I think with writing fiction, it can be a little bit like physical fitness. And it's by the end of a novel, all systems are kind of firing. You're really kind of built up, and you can kind of sometimes trick yourself into getting an extra piece of work out of it at the end. And two of my favorite stories in the novel came at the end of my last two, or stories came at the end of the last two novels. I wrote Retke and the Bughouse literally a couple of days after finishing my novel Beetlebone. Then you kind of tend to kind of collapse, a wasted heap in the corner. But it's strange, it's kind of, I do write in various kind of genres, and one of these writers is trying to succeed on so many fronts. I deserve to fail on them all. There is a kind of a traditional distrust in the all-rounder, which I think is absolutely earned. But it's what's weird, and I think a really, really kind of cool thing sometimes, is that working in one form can improve you in another one, in a kind of an odd, in a kind of a strange way. I remember a project that didn't get very far. I was trying to do a graphic novel with a friend of mine, an artist friend, who was drawing the pictures, and I was doing the words, and we got it like a chapter or two into it. But I think I learned a lot about writing short stories, watching the way Ali drew a story, and realizing how much, especially in the short form, how much scaffolding you can remove, and the thing is still kind of a working machine. And it was a kind of a really, really kind of instructive to look at that. I've been making short films, and had a small budget feature made a couple of years ago, and it was really interesting to look at an editor in the editing suite, cutting a story together, and so much was kind of so familiar from just the process of prose fiction, all that cutting and pasting and moving stuff around that you do. So it's I think it can be very valuable in kind of unexpected ways to work in different forms. It causes an impatience as well. I'm always desperate to get on to the next thing. I'm never happy with the thing I'm doing. It's just, I can't wait to go back to that play script or that story. It's never, always retrospectively happy in my work, never happy at the time.
I mean, it's amazing. I'm in awe, and I wish I could come and intern for you and learn how to do multiple things. But actually, that makes me wonder. I'll ask you one more question, and maybe we'll have you read for a few more minutes, and then I'll ask you a couple more questions, then we'll open it to the audience.
Yeah.
But this question was that you led a very peripatetic life till you were about 36, 37. And then suddenly, for the last 13 years, you've now been in one place, in a rural, quiet, in the countryside, writing kind of like, a wild man, like just producing all sorts of amazing things.
Yeah.
Is there a connection between those two things? The sort of like the fact that you're journeying in so many forms now, and we're journeying in so many
I definitely have a classic sort of cradle Catholic guilt complex that I didn't work hard enough in my 20s, where I was kind of, I was trying to write stories, and I was attempting these terrible novels, but I wasn't really giving it everything. A lot of that I was busy, I was kind of working as a freelance journalist. I was paying the rent. I was out on the town a little bit more in my 20s than I have been subsequently. But I kind of got very serious around the time of my 30th birthday, which isn't today nor yesterday. But I remember vividly where I was. I was down the coast a bit here in West Cork, and I remember the date and everything. I was walking out on this cliff, and I remember saying to myself, I've been trying to write a novel, I've been trying stories, and I remember saying to myself, like very earnestly, talking to myself, my lips moving, saying, "Are you serious? are you actually, really going to have a proper go at this? Because you're doing it in a kind of a half-assed way, really, at the moment. I'd start writing at 4 o'clock in the morning, having crawled home from a nightclub, kind of a thing, and it would seem like genius for about an hour and a half, and then in the cold light of day, you'd look over the page and go, "Oh my God!" It's just more of it. But I remember that day vividly, kind of making a kind of a statement to myself, going, yeah, I'm going to give it kind of everything I have to become a published kind of writer. And I think of that date as my kind of my writer's birthday almost. I kind of mark it August 13th every year, because it's somehow important at that point, before you're publishing even in journals or anything, just to kind of declare it to yourself, to kind of come out about it, saying, look, I'm doing this thing. And it's important somehow to start telling people you're doing it, to start telling your friends and stuff. And it can, of course, it can be embarrassing, because you meet people on the street and it's like, how's the novel going? I'm just like, oh, which one was I telling you about? I've started another 4 since then, but it's somehow important to make that declaration that I'm going to do this thing, and I'm going to kind of give it as much as I can muster to bring to it.
So why don't we have you? Yeah, if there's another story that you want to read from, that would be wonderful.
Sure, I'll read. I'm like a lot of writers, I guess. I'm always wary of writer narrators, because it seems a kind of a lazy move. But I couldn't resist one in a story called Old Stock. I'll just read the opening page or two from that story. The spring had been long and cold. The wind that came across the lake still had winter's bite. The house was wearing its age and ached loudly in the wind, as though poorly. And I was myself sick in the bowel, the gut, and the gums, or the nerves, in other words, or the soul. I badly needed to get out of County Sligo, and it was word of an imminent debt that allowed me to. Early in May, the call came through that Uncle Aldo was on his way out up in Donegal. It was a miracle that he was even going still. Aldo had drank like a fool always, and chased women and crashed cars. He burned summonses. He fell out of a hotel one time and landed on a taxi. I was the last of his close relations. He was my father's only brother, and my father was long dead. It was the lungs, in either case, that would cart them off. The lungs and the dampness, I suppose. Here's a very old joke. Cause of death, the west of Ireland. Aldo had been a figure of my childhood. His visits had been antic, unpredictable. I remember him one Christmas in plaster of Paris to the shoulder, lurching into the house, lame as an old pirate, and nagging of John Power's whiskey in his free paw. Another time in the company of a foul-mouthed blind girl called Margaret, once so atrociously drunk he pissed in a corner of the guest room, and there was murder over it. My mother put him out of the house next morning. But I had seen him infrequently in recent years, and I was surprised that contact had been made at all, and to be summoned to his deathbed like this. I aimed the car north for Donegal, and though my business was sombre, I felt a quiet soaring of the heart. I clearly welcomed this chance of a visit to the country outside Glentees, where my uncle was living out this last spell. And yes, it was very beautiful there. It was early in the Maytime, and there were dreamy glens and rooky woods and all the rest of it. The mountains in their pure realm and so forth. And being closer to the coast, the sky was clearer, the air that much quicker, the expanse of clean, raw light was reviving. And anyway, Aldo was 80 fucking odd. I mean, how devastated was I supposed to be? His cottage looked across a bog to the Blue Stack Mountains. The ocean nearby, unseen but palpable. Huge granite boulders around the fields, as if giants had been tossing them about for sport. The ocean hissed at the edges of the scene like a busy gossip. Salt on the air, the local cars wore coats of rust. I felt somehow a little hardier, tougher in myself as I looked out from the doorway of Aldo's place. I was in shade from the noon sunlight under the strands of a whitethorn's blossom. I rested its tiny flowers in the palm of my hand and blew on them. Bad luck, they say, to bring it into the house. The doctor smiled. Are you superstitious? More so than I used to be, actually.
Thank you, Kevin. Sorry that you can't hear any applause. It's a weird thing
I
to
know.
stop.
The
to stop
Zoom
your
readings, the Zoom readings, you're kind of waiting for the laughs when
Yeah.
you do a Zoom reading, and they're not coming. It is so it's slightly weird, but it's still nice to have some connection.
So I was going to ask you about place, and this is a perfect story to connect that to, because you say in this story later that the writer narrator says, the central philosophy underpinning all of my work to date was that places exerted their own feelings. Nonsense, of course, half thought out old guff that sounded okay at literary events. But now here in Aldo's cottage, there was incontrovertible evidence that it was the case. And he also says this place could wreak fucking havoc on a man's prose if you let it, right? So this comes up a lot. I know you've said it before in interviews too. And so I'm wondering, how do you as the writer out gathering impressions and material for your work commune with the place? Like, what form does it take? Is it just you sitting in your cottage kind of looking out, grasping for memories, or is there a more active form of communing with the landscape that you write about?
Well, actually, it's I think it goes back when my first book of stories came out in 2007. There are Little Kingdoms, and I started to do literary events for the first time, and you find yourself developing answers that sound impressive that might be complete bullshit, but you asked a classic, where did the stories come from? And I developed this very eloquent sounding answer about found dialogue and kind of Hiberno English and all this kind of stuff. And I remember delivering this quite eloquently one day at an event, and finding myself thinking simultaneously, this is total bollocks. This isn't how I write at all. And I started to think about each of my stories and attempts at novels and plays or whatever up to that point, and found that it's always a place is just a general prompt for me, and it's a kind of a feeling or a kind of just a sensation kind of exuded by a place that makes me want to create a piece of work in response to it. And it's very unpredictable what places will suggest themselves a setting for your stories and what ones won't. Very often for me, it's the west of Ireland. The stories kind of traipse around those roads with me, and it's very, very. There was a great Irish philosopher called John Moriarty, who passed away a few years ago. But he used to say that every field in the west of Ireland had its own kind of feeling or resonance, and it can be a very happy, joyous feeling that you would pick up and respond to as you walked across the field, or it could be a very melancholy, very haunted feeling. And I do believe in this at some kind of ethereal level that this is the case. Certainly, it tends to be when I get out of the house, when I move around, when I travel a little bit, that stories start to present and suggest themselves to me. It's strange though, like a lot of you talked about my background moving a lot. I spent a lot of my 20s and 30s in just across the Irish Sea in the UK, in England and in Scotland. And I was in Liverpool for just about 2 years and didn't particularly love my time living there, but I got loads of work out of it, lots of stories set there, and I used a Liverpool accent for my John Lennon novel Beetlebone. I lived then in Edinburgh for about 4 years, for much longer, and I loved it, and I never got a word out of the place. I just wasn't tuning into anything there to give me that work. So it's mysterious. You can't really plot it too much what places are going to give you kind of stories, but it's definitely how I work. It may be as simple as the fact that my background is journalistic as well, and I was in the practice of going to a place to get a story, and just bringing some of that into my fictional practice.
Well, maybe to get a little more specific, be kind of interesting to hear about your process. I know that there's this great story in this collection, Ox Mountain Death Song, which you talked about, which is kind of like your Western, where there's like a cop chasing a kind of never do well who comes from a generation, a kind of family tree of people who've always been like crazy characters around. And I think you said somewhere else that you were cycling around the Ox Mountains and you got this like strange feeling about the place. It's wet and miserable and windy, and there's a story there, right? But there's a big leap from going from there, from a feeling, to like transposing another genre
Yeah.
onto it. And so I'm curious. I mean, obviously, I know it's mysterious what actually happens, right, with these things.
Yeah.
But also, how does that come about? That
I like to cycle. I go out on my bike, and since we moved here in 2007, I've been going west and crossing the Ox Mountains, which are really hills. You know, in our grandiloquent Irish way, we call them mountains. They're about like 400 feet high. But anytime I cycled over there, it was always really miserable and wet, and just kind of wanted to get past it. But it kept suggesting to me as a setting. It was so kind of gloriously bleak. And I said, actually, I remember writing that. I said what I was going to do, I was going to kind of write it on location. And I went out and stayed in a little hotel by the coast out there for a few days. And I was driving around, soaking myself in the aura of this place, trying to get the story. And of course, I had no characters, but I pulled into a petrol station, a gas station on my bike, just to get like an orange juice. And I was just outside drinking my orange juice, and a police car rolled in across to the forecourt, and this really big, fat old cop got out and just kind of slugged across the forecourt. And I said, well, there's one of them. Okay, that's one of them. Now I just have to find out who he's after. And it became a kind of a sheriff and an outlaw story, essentially, that wrote itself then very, very quickly in the couple of days out there. And it's yeah. So that's one example of it, I guess. And it's just a lucky thing sometimes when you get this character that you can hear quite quickly. And I just felt I could hear this old cop for some reason. And the visual prompt very, very often helps. The story Roma Kid you mentioned earlier on was a purely visual prompt. Seeing a young child, a Roma child on a train one day coming up Sligo, clearly on her own and clearly a little bit scared, and seeing if I could be bold enough to try and create a voice for her on the page.
Well, actually, and that story really stood out to me. It's one of maybe it's the only story with a non sort of native Western Ireland character, right? West Irish character.
Well, like Retke the poet, I guess, as well.
Of course,
yeah,
right.
But apart from that, yeah.
Right. So that and that story, I felt the Roma girl story was very successful. And it was also the quietest story in many ways in the collection. So were you aware, like how were you like how did you enter that 9-year-old girl's perspective? How did you come up with that tone that feels sort of different for yourself? Like, did that feel like a risk? You're taking a new tone.
I remember very vividly when I wrote a draft of that story. What was really striking to me was that there were no laughs. You know, there were no jokes at all. So that there are almost always jokes.
There were some laughs. I still
there maybe there's a couple when the character she meets comes into it gets funnier. But initially, when it was just describing this girl, it was I was going, you know, and you pay attention when it's something very different from your usual approach. You go, okay, so maybe this is a new way of telling a story. But no, it was prompted by that purely visual image, and then I guess, you know, writing from the child's point of view is so difficult. You try and go back through the mists of time to your own perception at that kind of age, how much you were taking in, what was changing about the way you were perceiving the world. She's kind of in very early adolescence. I see her as about 10 or 11, I guess, in the story. So it was. I remember it being very difficult, and the difficulty suggested an approach which was to take it purely at the level of the sentence and to let each sentence kind of suggest the next. I do believe often that you can work from rhythm. You can work from a kind of a story's inherent melody or tune. I remember years ago in kind of mid 90s, Don DeLillo came to Dublin, and he gave a reading. So, you know, it was packed to the rafters with all the kind of DeLillo boy fans, in their ranks. Of course, I was very much one of them. And I remember him saying something that kind of shook me to my boots. He said, like, I'm not very interested in the meaning of a sentence. I'm just purely interested in its sound and its rhythm, and that's what I'm looking for all the time. And he said you can let the story follow from the sound sometimes. And I remember going, wow, that's the way I want to work. That's the way I could see myself working. And I think it is true. I think prose fiction is in some ways a kind of a disappointed musical form. It's a kind of a lesser musical form. It aspires, all other art forms aspire to the condition of music and don't quite get there. But I definitely, I will work very much with the sound of the sentences, with the shapes they're making, and just try and let the rhythm kind of exert its presence on the page, and that can get past those moments of difficulty, like trying to write from the point of view of this young girl. If you get the rhythm right with the sentences, that can be a way into the world.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that's a great note on which to open it to the audience. I think it's about 7:40, so that gives us a good 20 minutes for people to ask questions. So I'm not sure how we're supposed to. Chris, I don't know if Chris is around, or if you're just supposed to. Maybe you can just look at the Q&A that is coming up here, Kevin.
Okay, I'm gonna have to press something, aren't I? Okay.
I can always pose the.
Oh, I see it. Yeah.
So if you want to pick up any of those questions and
okay,
and have a gander. Yeah.
Okay. Do you write best at a particular time of day or night? I have near mystical notions about how to try and generate flow in a story. And it's like yourself, Karen. It's very rare to get those happy kind of half hours or hours where the hand feels guided across the page. But you know when they happen, and it doesn't happen very often. But I find my best chance of getting that kind of flow going on the page and being able to hear the rhythms in the prose clearly is very first thing in the morning. When we mentioned DeLillo a minute ago, he said it beautifully. He said it's when you're still puddled in dream melt. When you're in that kind of sleepy kind of state where you're still halfway lost in your dreams, and in those nocturnal places, you can kind of tune into that subconscious level where the kind of stories form themselves and present themselves. It's very important for me not to go online in the morning, or my concentration is immediately shot. I've convinced myself that one, there is a God, and two, she has a giant lever to control the internet, and she only turns it on at 12 noon every day. So that's my thing. I don't have to look; it's not turned on yet. And it's very important to me to kind of leave that space for purely for my writing. But it changes. I think it's interesting to mix it up as a writer to try different things. I've lots of friends who are visual artists, and I notice the way they tend to be much more open than writers are to kind of interrogating their own practice and to try different things. And writers sometimes get stuck into kind of fixed ways of doing things. Whereas like with the most recent novel, Night Boat to Tangier, the two characters, these gangster characters, were kind of talking so much in my head, I started sleeping really badly. When I was working on the first draft of it, like not even an hour or two a night. And it was around the time like the Guardian and the New York Times kept running these news stories saying, we've now worked out that you need to sleep like 8 hours a night or you're like dead by like Tuesday. So and I said, fuck, I'm not sleeping, so I'm actually going to change my process completely. I'm going to work at night. And I started in this room, I started to kind of to write that novel. I'd start after my wife went to bed about midnight, and I'd go for it on the atmospherics. I'd light candles and have logs burning in the grate and all that, and it definitely gave a kind of a nocturnal atmosphere to that book, which it mightn't have had otherwise. But really important for me to try and mix it up and try and take new approaches and try and surprise myself.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah,
sorry,
sure.
Go on. No, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say you're a very different writer at 3 a.m. and at 10 a.m.
Right.
And it can be really interesting to see those different kind of sides of yourself.
Well, yeah. So a quick follow up was just that how many hours do you feel is a productive writing day for you, and what do you do when you're not writing? Like, how do you kill the time afternoon or whatever?
Yeah. I think it's kind of esoteric way of putting it, but when you say that you're going to write, when you make this declaration, and when you decide that you're going to be serious about it, what you're doing is you're making a pact with your own subconscious. You're saying, give me stuff, give me material, and I'll be available to it. And because I have this overhanging kind of guilt that I didn't work hard enough in my 20s, I'm disciplined now, and I try to stay in the room. It's a shed out the back of the house here. I try to stay in there for about 4 hours in the morning, from kind of 9ish till about 1. I might be writing for 20 minutes of that, but I'd be there and I'd be available to it if something should happen. And it's weird how often in the last half an hour you get a few sentences, and it's almost your subconscious just giving you enough to come back the next day. You know. I spend the afternoons trying to do everything possible not to think about the work. So if it's the summer, I'm kind of, we grow vegetables and all that. So I'm kind of farming it. I'm pulling weeds, and I like, we live across the road from a lake, so I go swimming and that kind of stuff. And it's just anything really that isn't writing, and it's not going to make me start thinking about it. And usually about what we call tea time, about 6 p.m. or so, I'll go back to the room and kind of look over the morning's work. And of course, it's something that seemed like, heaven sent genius at 11 a.m. by 5 p.m. can look awful. You go, oh God, more of this stuff. So it's I'll go back for about an hour then and just kind of read over stuff. But it's important for me, if I'm on a project, to try and do it 7 days a week, to kind of to keep a kind of a thread going. Even if it's only gone into the room for a half an hour on a weekend day or something, just to keep moving like that.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a bunch more questions here.
Yeah. These stories follow you around. I'm curious, any of your characters from this collection or previous books that follow and stick with you? Oh, yeah. So it's sometimes readers will ask, what happens next, after the story, or do you have any sense of it? And I never really, with a short story at least, and I never really hang on to the characters at any conscious level. It's never appealed to me to go and bring them back and to try them in a new situation. With the short stories, at least, I have noticed I've been working on a screenplay for Night Boat to Tangier, which involves taking those two characters and putting them into new situations that aren't in the book, and it's actually been great fun. Those characters remain kind of strong and vivid for me, but generally I tend not to revisit. I very rarely think about my characters once I've got them out. Like, there's the short story, and at either end of it for me, there are these kind of pools of black oily silence. I don't know what's going on, and I kind of feel that's kind of the right way, I guess, for it with me. What are other ways you've changed your process for writing a book? Oh God. The most, I published 3 novels at this point. I've attempted several more, but I think with the novel Beetlebone, which is about John Lennon attempting to visit his island off the west coast of Ireland, it came again from my bicycle, essentially, just from cycling around that part of the west of Ireland in the summer, and the beautiful place, Clew Bay. But anytime I was out there, I was getting this very melancholy feeling about it, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was the atmosphere of a novel. And anytime I was out cycling around that particular locale, I started to think about what Saul Bellow used to call my significant dead, friends and family members who had passed on, who I'd lost. And I started the novel. I knew this little pop cultural factoid about Clew Bay, that John Lennon had owned an island out there in the 60s and 70s and only visited twice ever. So then I decided with a sense of great glee and abandon, wow, I'm going to write a John Lennon novel. This is an absolutely fantastic idea. And about 3 weeks after starting it, going, oh God, this is so difficult, you know. And getting about 2 years into it, and it was still struggling to get a voice for him. But then one night I was in London. I'd been over doing a reading or something, and I escaped early, and I was just in this little pub on my own, just having a pint of beer. And I started to put down the facts of the story in a non-fictional way, just about John buying this island in the west of Ireland. And as I wrote these very, very nice sentences started to form in very interesting paragraphs. And I started to write for the first time directly about my mother's death when I was 10. And I thought, what the fuck is this doing in my John Lennon novel? But I knew I was getting to the heart of it. And I realized then that Beetlebone was a portrait of an artist. And to make a portrait of an artist, you have to bring anything you possibly can from your own experience to make it real. And I knew that the early loss of a parent was something that I shared with Lennon. And it's weird. It seems to be it's quite a common thing when you look at artists and writers and musicians' biographies, that early loss of a parent seems to create some kind of need to make work in response to that early view of the void. So this led me to putting a kind of a non-fictional essay in the middle of my novel and seeing if I could get away with that. Just explaining how the story formed for me and what it meant to me to write it. There's a quick question. Which Bolano book is the girl reading in Deer Season? It's 2666, I think, if I'm right about the cover. I had a big Bolaño phase a couple of years ago. I love 2666. I love some of the shorter work, like By Night in Chile and Antwerp. I think they have kind of pretty much cleared every hard drive now, and they've published kind of maybe a little too much of the work that wasn't quite there. But 2666 struck me reading it as one of the great kind of one of the great advances in the novel that we've seen in recent decades, and it's a very special book to me, and I know to a lot of other readers.
Just to add to that, he strikes me as a truly rhythmic writer. Like sometimes you're reading him and you're like, this is actual nonsense, but it's so brilliantly rhythmic, and it keeps you going.
Yeah,
like it's kind of an amazing thing about him.
You're staying with it purely because of that rhythm. Even in something like one of the very, very dense, shorter books like Antwerp, where a lot of the time you haven't a clue what's going on. But the rhythm holds you. I noticed that just a couple of nights ago. I was reading an essay by the great American essayist Annie Dillard from a collection that came out called The Abundance, and I think it was from her. It might have been an extract from her book Holy the Plough from the 70s. And I had no idea what was going on in this paragraph, but the rhythm was amazing, you know, and that kept me in there. Just looking, there's one or two others. Your work is evocative in that a single sentence will crack open a window to another world. You only get a glimpse of that world. Is that evocative quality intentional? Yeah, like the short story is the glimpse, really, isn't it? It's that kind of art. I often think that a short story has less in common with the novel than it has with like the poem or with a painting or something. It's a very different kind of frame, and it's the difficulty of the short story. I think is something that really kind of attracts me to it as a form. The fact that it doesn't get easier. I realized publishing a third collection of them is kind of a bit of a statement. You could almost publish a second collection by accident, but 3 makes me feel like I'm going to be a lifer with the form, that I'm going to keep going and keep trying more of them. But it's I think it's no accident that the very best story writers are the writers who stick with the form over the course of their careers, who keep publishing book after book after book of stories. It's a very difficult form that needs a lifetime's devotion, and that's absolutely what I intend to give it.
See, so have you got all the questions here? I think pretty much.
I think we've been through them.
maybe the one from Walton. I think you've answered some of this, the process.
Oh,
of
can you
building
discuss your
stories.
process of building stories or your daily writer working
You
with
work
symbols?
longhand, yeah.
Yeah, I often try a first draft in longhand because it just kind of slows you down a little bit compared to the keyboard, and it can just seem that you're getting a little bit more care into the draft. But the critical kind of juncture for me really is what it feels like a penultimate draft, which might be number 3 or 4, typically with a short story. And at that point, I print it out and I kind of act it. I do it aloud. I read it aloud and I do all the voices with my red pen in hand, because that's when you catch all the kind of the evasions where you're not really getting to the heart of the story, and your eye will very happily glance over stuff on the screen and think that's all fine. But as soon as you hear it on the air, as soon as you put it into the room, you realize no, it's not quite there yet, and it needs something more. So the ear is always such a critical tool for writing.
Kevin, so we'll maybe end with one last question I have for you, because I think we've covered all the audience questions. The question I had for you is, you've written at one point, you don't write because things are going swimmingly and you're feeling fabulous. You write because you're a fucking disaster zone made up of fear and dread and anxiety and all the edgy, angsty stuff that just means you're alive, basically. And every second of it is just a profound and beautiful shock. What are the moments when in your writing process when these feelings of dread and anxiety and angst go away? Like, what are those moments? The moments where like you feel true pleasure in it, or you can take pleasure in the work you've done without being self-critical. When do those
Yeah.
arise?
It's a spooky business, writing fiction, and it's mysterious, and it seems to give you just enough of those moments to keep you coming back for more punishment. I was saying when I was a younger writer, I wasn't very disciplined. I am disciplined now, but if I go to my workroom 7 days a week, there's probably only 1 or 2 days when it seems like it's going well in any way at all, when there's some sort of flow going. But what you learn, and this is something I saw Hilary Mantel talk about as well, which was kind of heartening, is that there are no shortcuts to getting to that happy half an hour where the hand is guided and it moves across the page. You have to go through those slow, sludgy days where you're just sitting there and you'd rather be doing anything else. You'd rather be down a coal mine. But you have to sit through the sludgy days, and actually those are the days when you're really writing. That's when the stuff is forming in your subconscious and getting ready to come onto the page. But that nice half an hour you get when suddenly there's 300 or 400 words and you know that that's going into the final story or the final or into the novel or whatever it is. Those are worth a great deal, and keep you coming back for more.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks for great reading and for great answers. And yeah, congrats on the great New York Times review today. And thank you all for your great questions.
Thanks so much, Karan. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. Cheers.
Yeah, great talking to you too.
That was so good. That was excellent talk about craft and writing. One of the best we've had. Thank you so much to Karan and Kevin and everybody who asked questions. And can still buy a signed copy from Powerhouse. If you missed any of the event, we'll have it on YouTube soon.
Thanks so much, guys. Thanks a million. Thanks for doing it.
Bye.
Cheers.